Everybody. Today I'm going to be talking kind of about children and youth related things, families. I may break this into two videos because I think that there's going to be assignments that I want you to do that we would normally be doing in person in class, and I just think it might be hard to fit it into one. So when I stop, I'm going to also attach two videos to this. So take a look at them. Hopefully they're helpful videos to you. They shouldn't be anything to stress about. Let me begin by saying that I wanted to clarify federal, state, county agencies just to make sure that you were clear on how this went. And it has a lot to do with how laws are passed and the how three tiers of government and all. So many of the programs that counties implement, and that would include children and youth, which is abuse and neglect, mental health programs, our area agency on aging programs for seniors. A lot of these programs come from federal government money that is then transferred to the state government, and then the state government passes it to us. And when the federal government does it, it has rules attached, and then when the state passes it to us, they add their own rules, and then we have our own policies that we have to that we provide, but they can't contradict what the state or federal government has. So just to understand that when things come down, sometimes counties have to do certain policies just in order to get that federal funding. And without that federal and state funding, we wouldn't be able to provide the service. I'll just give you an example. Children and youth social workers. The state gives us 80% of the cost of the salary and benefits for each worker. 80%. So if we don't do what the state wants, follow state rules, state guidelines, we're not going to get that 80%. And then we would have to find a way to raise that money. And given that we have about 200 social workers in children and youth, that would be quite a hefty raise of property taxes. So we like it that the state gives us that money. So remembering, there are some things like Head Start programs, which is for preschoolers. Head Start programs is federal funding, but it is applied for by the direct agencies that are going to provide the Head Start. In Bucks County, the intermediate unit has the grant for Head Start. They can provide Head Start services in one place, or they can divide it up and go into other kinds of daycares or preschools and provide funding to people who want their children to learn from Head Start. Head Start's a great federal program worth every penny that it costs. It's one that every time they study it, it's good to do that. The state government in Pennsylvania, I just want to give you an example. Now they do CHIP. They may get some of that funding from the federal government through Medicare dollars and Medicaid dollars, but the state develops CHIP and puts some of their own money in it. The county actually does the jail almost completely on county tax dollars with very little funding from the state or federal government. So you can see how complicated this is. It's not easy when you're trying to run the government. And then on top of that, we then contract with local private agencies to deliver services. So they may deliver services to a senior citizen in their home, to children and youth, to families. They may provide therapy to those families. We can talk more in a little bit about what kind of services that get delivered. But I do want to make a clarity there too, that there are private nonprofit and for-profit kind of agencies out there. Obviously, the for-profit means they're going to make a profit. And the idea really for profits is, yeah, they do make money, and that does mean that the owners of the agency, have more and more money. They can put more money into their own pockets and pay people more. But there is a quality ideal there, that if they're going to charge more and they're going to have they're going to keep some of that money, they better have a pretty high quality service. Now, nonprofits, what that means is they can make a profit, but they have to turn that profit back into the agency and expand services or improve services or add extra bathrooms to the facility or something. So I just want to make sure you knew that nonprofit versus profit thing. So turning to children and families, let's remember that, we know that there have been children always, and there have been family always, but in much of history, children were raised by a tribe, or they were raised sort of in that community. That whole idea of it takes a village, that was often true. Children were not always treated well. They were treated often as little adults. It was really more towards modern times that we realized how different children were and started to develop laws on child abuse and things. Childhood has never been easy for kids, even worse, hundreds and thousands of years ago. Many times children would die very quickly. I think in most families they lost at one point half of their children before they were two. All kinds of diseases and pandemics that would go through the world would take its toll, obviously, on children. And this is back before we understood medicine or vaccines or anything like that. If you go back as far as Greece, there was a point where um, families could have a child and they could wait 5 days to decide if they were going to keep the baby or not. It was infanticide, and maybe that family wanted a girl baby, or they wanted a boy and they didn't get it, or whatever was happening, they were allowed to do that. Um, it was finally the churches, the Catholic Church, Episcopal Church, and other churches that started to recognize that this was not moral behavior and started advocating that families had to take care of their children. It was, in fact, those churches that first developed in 700s and 800 AD what they called children's asylums, and those were places sort of like orphanages. The unfortunate part of those orphanages is to a certain extent they were often in farms where the children were asked to work on the farm. So that was, they had to almost work to get their food. And eventually they became, if you guys have seen Oliver before, they became workhouses. And the children worked at some kind of a job during the day, and that job helped the asylum to be able to keep them there. Then came the orphan trains, which you're reading about and we'll talk more about. That was another idea, to take kids and put them out to families in the West who wanted to adopt. But we know from the orphan train what happened. Then there was no way of looking at families back then to see how this was going to go and whether the families were going to be good quality families for these children. It's also important to remember, and I think I believe I said this in another lecture, that until the Industrial Revolution, families kind of lived on farms. So they self-cared for one another, for themselves. Once they moved from that village concept, once you lived on a farm, you provided everything for your family there. But as things began to industrialize, that was when families started working in businesses and in industry, and they would have to leave the home every day and come home, and during those days someone had to provide for the children. That was kind of when schools started to become really important, because that was where people would send their kids. It also became a point where children started to go perhaps to work too early, but overall the family was becoming a buffer between work and home. So people came home, and it was often a very private kind of life. You didn't want people to know what was going on at home. And so there was things that happened in the families, abuse, neglect, that we didn't know about, that people didn't want to talk about, but that eventually became to surface as children began to go more and more to school, and we started to have child labor laws that they had to stay in school till they were 16 and later 18. That allowed people, teachers and whatnot, to see a little bit more of a glimpse into what was happening into individual families. Those friendly visitors I talked about that were initial social workers that sometimes went into homes, and the settlement house workers, they often observed abuse and neglect, and they would try to help. There is a case, maybe one of you will see that, bring this up in the discussion, that Mary Ellen Wilson, I believe it was in the 1860s, it might have been a little bit later than that, but she was abused. The friendly visitor came to the house, didn't know what to do. There was no child welfare agencies then, so she took her to the SPCA. And literally, we had an SPCA in the United States before we had children and youth workers or anything. And that was what first drew attention to the need to do something for children. The first Child Abuse Act was 1974. 1974, when I was 13 at the time. That was the first time that the United States federal government took a stand and said, we're not going to allow child abuse. But what they did was kind of hold out that carrot. They gave money to the states to develop child abuse programs, to do investigations on child abuse and child neglect. And they had certain rules. And one of the rules was that doctors, nurses, teachers, social workers were going to have to be mandatory reporters. If they found child abuse or neglect, they had to report it. Their very job, their license was all at stake if they did not do that. We still abide by that, but states are allowed to give some of their own rules as to what abuse and neglect is. I am not a big fan of Pennsylvania's. Pennsylvania's rule of neglect and abuse is that there has to be a visible wound. If it's physical, it has to have hurt. It has to potentially have caused damage. So, you know, spanking is definitely allowed. I have had cases where kids have had marks, and children and youth was not allowed to call that child abuse. So it's kind of tough. Um, we are still using that um, Child Abuse and Treatment Act that was passed as part of the Social Security Act in 1974 to do funding all for children and youth, but there is never enough. I always say it would be so great if we could spend some of the money that we have educating young parents, helping young parents to know different ways to discipline their children, what to do with yourself when you're overwhelmed. You can have a pretty perfect life and children can still stress you out, and we need to be able to give tools to people so they know what to do. So I'm going to use my notes here for a minute because what I'm going to say I think is important to hear, and of course this is not something I could memorize either, but what I'm asking you to listen for is the changes that happened since 1974 in the way that government was looking at child abuse, child neglect, and children and youth, and starting to step in over the years to do a little bit more. 1974, of course, was the first act. 1978 was when they added Indian tribes directly to this, so that indigenous tribes that were in America had their own courts, their own mandates. They were trying to make sure that they were involved with those families on reservations that were, and how abuse was going on there. 2 years later, in 1980, they passed another Special Needs Adoptions Act. So they started to encourage people to adopt children that were handicapped, children with developmental disabilities. And there was a big emphasis on that. I can't remember commercials for that when I was like almost in college. In 1993, they passed the Family Preservation and Family Support Act. This was when we started to really emphasize not putting kids into foster care. This has been a big effort. This was, try not to pull kids away, try to deliver the services in the home, try to keep the kids there. If you can't, try to put them in with a close friend or kinship member of that family. In 1994, they started to realize how much substance abuse and mental health was affecting a part of why some families had child abuse and neglect. And there was education put forth to train social workers and others how to deal with mental health and substance abuse issues. And money came out for children and youth to hire private agencies to work with families. The Adoption and Safe Families Act came out in 1997, and this, I believe, is still the current act too, that there has to be a permanency hearing within 12 months of a child being removed from the home. Children who are in care for, I believe it's 22 months straight, if there has been no contact with the family of origin, they can be open for adoption. I will say that I have found that I believe every time the biological family does get involved in that initial 15 to 22 months, it resets the clock. So let me just describe what that means. If a child is up for adoption and the family has not tried to see that child for 9 months and then 11 months, but in the 12th month, the father and mother call and say they want to see that child, now the clock resets. We start again, waiting the 12 to 15 months to make that child available for adoption. And the good news is sometimes families need a few times to get back together before they can heal. The tough part, of course, is that all those years the child's waiting to be adopted, if the parents don't decide to get into treatment and to get help, that child has stayed in the foster care system all of that time. In 2000, some of you may be aware of that, they passed the Child Abuse Prevention Enforcement Act's Safe Haven, which meant that if someone had a baby and they would drop that baby off at a firehouse, a police department, or a hospital, that they weren't going to go after them and try to press charges necessarily. They might try to find the parent to provide them help, but it was the Safe Haven Act, and so that meant that you realized you couldn't take care of your baby and you were trying to do something. It was preventing people from taking their children's lives because they couldn't provide care anymore. In 2008, that was when the federal government realized we needed to do something about this foster care by really making agencies or states have to look for kinship, for family members who would take a child. Right now that we have workers who are just focused on that because they actually have to reach out across the nation and try to find family members, aunts, uncles, cousins. So it takes a while. They get really good at trying to find people. I've had students in class before tell me that children and youth reached out to a relative or reached out to them as a relative for somebody in another state. And it does keep it in the family. There is something to be said for that. I think it's important. We have, I just want to give you a figure here. When I came into office in 2008, I think we had between 300 and 400 children in foster care. We are down to 150 now. A lot of these acts came during this time, so you can see that it works. It's certainly kinship care can be nice if a sister or brother has your children while you work to heal, as opposed to a foster family that maybe lives in another county. That just makes healing so much harder. In 2018, they passed the Family First Preservation Act, and that literally was saying, hey, we're going into the house with family group decision making, high fidelity, what was called SWAT programs, and wraparound programs. The video that I'm going to attach next is called is about family group decision making. Now, in all fairness, it may be from a Danish film, and it's a cartoon, but it is the best I've seen of somebody trying to explain what family group decision making is. But in essence, it means that the social worker from children and youth or the agency that's been assigned to the family has like a family meeting. There is food as part of that family meeting. Teachers are invited, ministers, next door neighbors, family members, anybody that the child and the parents identify as being a support. And in that meeting, it is led to come up with different ways to help that child get what they need. So it might be a ride to school. It might be one of the aunts who says, I will take care of their medical needs and making sure they're getting all their checkups and dental care. It could be somebody who volunteers to make sure they get to school in the morning. Someone else does it in the afternoon. Somebody volunteers to get onto the baseball team. Somebody may volunteer to take mom food shopping. So they put that together, and then they continue to have those meetings, every so often, maybe once a month, every couple months, and just to make sure that everything is fine. The last thing that I want to say about this before I go and let you see those videos is, as we go through trying to help families, we operate from this notion of least restrictive environment. That's LRE, least restrictive environment. You'll hear this again with schools. But the idea is that we try to do the least amount we can in intervening with families. So you might try, for example, with a young family that's having some problems, or maybe you think there's abuse or neglect, getting that child into daycare. Because maybe it needs a little more stimulation during the day. Maybe mom needs some time out during the day. So you're going to try to get them into a Head Start program or a daycare through Apple Daycare or something like that. You might bring somebody into the home. Some agencies do this and kind of help mom learn a little bit more about how to cook, how to clean, how to manage her day. Sometimes that can happen. You can have family therapy. Maybe there is a conflict between mom and dad, whether they're together or not. And they'll have a worker come into the home, or they'll have the family come into the agency, and they will do, intervention through family therapy. Kinship care would be the next level of care. Removing to foster care would be the next level. We try really not to do this, but, an institutional care, like a group home, can happen if the child is kind of acting out, if the family isn't ready to take them back, and if there isn't a family member around that is ready to take care of that child. So I'm going to end this for right now. As I said, I'm going to attach 2 videos, and I'll have a couple questions about what I just said, and then I'll come back and do the second part that I want to talk about with children and families. So thanks.